All right, so we're here for our second in our series of webinars on unpacking the new and changing NRS standards. This one is covering program entry and exit and periods of participation. So again, we're going to do our very, very best to get this done in 60 minutes or less, but that does not mean that I don't want you to ask questions if you have them. Please, please, if you have questions or comments, be sure to chime in and ask. I'm happy to answer them if I can, and if not, I know last time John was making notes for us to check some information with our federal partners and others so that we can answer those questions hopefully in the future. I wanted to start today just reviewing a little bit that the participants and reportable individuals training that we did last week. And now that you've had some time for reflection and thought, did anybody have any additional questions about those issues that we talked about last week, participants and reportable individuals?
I just kind of wanted to know what the discussion ended up being about. Well, just in terms of, I think that the consensus was that we have 12 hours to make sure that we're getting all the information in accurately reflected. But then my question is there going to be something to maybe talk to enrollment staff about, some training we could roll out for enrollment staff so that they're a little better versed in trying to talk people through all of those barriers to employment?
I think that's certainly something that we can consider, Steph. I don't know if that would be better done at a state level or at the local level, but definitely I think you're right. And one of the points that John and I had a discussion about when we were working on the new version of the intake form was that the form doesn't do the work, we do the work, and training on how to complete that form is one of the things that we felt was pretty essential. So John, did you have any thoughts about that?
I wanted to mention that I heard, or that I received Steph's question. She had asked about high poverty areas and free and reduced lunch, correct, Steph?
Yeah.
And of course that free and reduced lunch, I mean, and she coupled these questions with this need for sensitive intake and asking some of these very personal questions when we don't have that rapport built. And I'm wondering, to that point, if we could somehow create a sequencing in terms of what are the questions here under economic disadvantage that are the least intrusive that we could identify and not have to delve into how much we make, right? And so I would think if you have a child that's on a free or reduced lunch, then you automatically would be considered economic disadvantage, right? And then go through the more, and get more detailed or granular if we need to, and still being sensitive to their, privacy and so forth. There was that question about youth living in high poverty area, and so I talked to my Title I colleagues, Laura and Kendra, and they shared a definition with me that I can forward, but in reading the information, a census tract, a set of continuous census tracts, Indian reservation, tribal land, or Native Alaskan village, or a county that has a poverty rate of at least 30% as set every 5 years using American Community Survey data. Youth who live in a high poverty area is automatically considered low income, and then listed South Dakota counties of Bennett, Buffalo, Corson, Dewey, Millette, Oglala, Lakota, Todd, and Ziebach. So, I mean, we need to put this information together, and then Kendra and Laura even sort of qualified that this definition might change with a new youth TEGL, and I don't know if that'll have ramifications for other programming, but I do think there is a need to maybe find a way that we can hone the intake so that we can not make someone walk out of there with a label necessarily of, oh yes, I am economic disadvantaged, but just recognizing that, oh yeah, I do receive EBT, or I'm on TANF right now, and just move forward to the next criteria.
Well, and then my other weird, so I have my Native American students tend to always mark cultural barriers. And just in talking to them, the big thing that they identify is that they don't feel like we recognize their version of time very well. And so for me, that's a hard one to quantify, but I do believe that that is probably a cultural barrier to employment if you don't go to work on time every time.
Well, and I think the very definition is that if they're self-identifying that barrier, then yes, it is a barrier for them. So I think that you're perfectly okay in marking that then. Yeah, that's a perfect example of, you know, we might not recognize that, but they are saying this is an issue for me, so, and it's part of my culture. So I think yes, that's definitely a cultural barrier.
Well, and it's actually become kind of a sticky issue at enrollment. When I'm going over it with enrollment, they get a little bit upset by that question.
Well,
and I don't know. I'm going to have to think of new and different ways to handle that a little better, I think, because I do want to be sensitive. At the same time, it's hard.
Steph, this is interesting to me. I find it interesting. So that you've had situations where the students feel defensive or get upset or have a negative reaction because we're essentially identifying labels that you as a Native American have a cultural barrier. It's not, is that the essence? It's
yeah, they feel like when they accept that it, well, they feel like it's one directional. And so they get a little, they get their backs raised pretty quickly, and then, like I always tell them, this is just for intake purposes. Let's talk a little more about that later, and then I try to pull them aside one by one because there's no sense in having everybody stressed right at the beginning.
okay. Any other questions about participants and reportable individuals before we get into today's content?
Yeah, Becki.
Mm-hmm.
This is Laura.
Hi, Laura.
We had, you and I had touched base just briefly on the implication of Table 2A and what that might look like differently in different programs in terms of data entry.
Right, and that conversation, Table 2A is that proposed table for next fiscal year. It will go into effect July 1st, 2017. And that's the table where everyone who is a reportable but not a participant will appear. And Laura and I had visited, and one of the things we know about Table 2A is it will look very similar to Table 2. And if you know Table 2, what it reports is age, race, and sex. So, you know, Laura's question was, do we have to data enter anything other than those data points before a person hits that 12-hour mark, since that's what Table 2A will track for the reportables. And, you know, I think that this is something that I believe, and you all can disagree with me if you want to, certainly, but I believe is probably best left as a local decision. I know in our program we like to capture as much data as possible at the beginning. So we generally try to capture all the data points that we can when someone comes into the program. Other programs might not feel that same way. And I do think that maybe that's something that can be, unless John has a plan for a state policy regarding that data entry and how expediently the full data should be put in, that's something that could be left up to local control unless a federal guidance piece comes along with the implementation of Table 2A that tells us something else. That's my big disclaimer always.
Yeah, this is something that I thought it might be helpful for us to just touch base on briefly today, because as programs are writing, most likely in the process of writing RFPs and trying to decide how much time they are going to need to budget for additional data entry, it might be worth considering, you know, based on our local programming needs, are you a program that will continue to enter all information from the intake on any individual that walks through the door, or will you opt to, if it's allowable, to enter just the required fields for those that are reportables but not yet participants because they haven't acquired those 12 hours of instruction yet. And I think, as Becki was mentioning, it can really vary from site to site what would be most practical. And I know in our context we have so many people that walk through the door that we never see again that are not accruing those 12 hours. It feels like a wasted resource for us to input everything on that intake form for that individual. So if there's other guidance from John, I'd like to hear that too. But from what we're seeing in terms of what Table 2A is going to look like, that might be something for programs to consider as they look ahead.
So I know too, CLC of the Black Hills and a host of other providers or their satellites have their own local, culturally instituted sort of processes for handling these individuals who have fewer than 12 hours, and we have deferred to local control. But my question as we move forward here, and we are required to report on these individuals that have fewer than 12 hours, is your notion that you won't collect all the data initially, that you'll just collect the age, the name, and some of these real basic demographics, or that you'll collect all the information on the intake form, but you won't take the time to date or enter more than the minimum requirements? Or as a third option, like we've been discussing, that you can enter the the primary information, and then over the course of those first 12 hours, as you get the barriers to employment and some of these other more specific data, it'll be a combination of the two previous routes, I guess.
John, this is Laura again, and I appreciate that you're positing, these different scenarios. For our program, we have practices that have worked pretty well for us in the past, and what would likely most benefit what we need to do would be entering just the minimal information on those that are reportables until they become a participant. But yes, we would collect, in fact, we collect all information right away. So we have that intake form complete, but if we have that option to continue holding that until they get 12 hours, but we would enter the initial required data prior to the accrual of 12 hours in order to meet the needs of this intake. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm curious, and I don't want to put specific individuals on the spot, but I'm curious, the larger providers, DOC, CLC of the Black Hills, STI, and even Cornerstones in aggregate, I mean, would it impact you? Are you looking to lessen or sort of mitigate the initial data entry requirements or the data collection requirements, or does that vary too across programs?
I think that we're kind of looking at using some front support staff to do initial data entry. So they would enter the initial data fields, and it would free up everybody else to do their job better.
We had tried.
So it's just something that we're looking at.
This is Kim. We've tried some different things before, especially like when we're off location site. But what we found is if we don't do as much as possible right from the start, that we end up losing people in the drawer.
Yeah.
And so we spend a lot more time trying to cross-check attendance sheets with intake forms, with the LACE system. And I think we ended up spending so much more time on the back end that we found that it was easier to try and get everything done on the front end.
And Becki, I know you've got a lot of material to cover, and we're already 15 minutes in. One final thought on that is, or not a concluding thought, but something I'd like to add in terms of, finding a support staff who can just enter in student intakes. Is that what you're thinking, Steph and others?
Yeah.
or these individuals aren't going to be necessarily going back into the record and adding tape scores and those other data that really require
They just would do
detailed
the initial, the very initial data entry as people are getting signed up to take assessments. And then the rest of it would fall right back to like it is now.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for this conversation. I think this is going to help us consider policy and training needs as we move forward here. Thank you. Good.
Very good. Very good. Thanks, everybody. So let's move into our topic of the day, which is program entry and exit and periods of participation. Program entry is going to be pretty simple. Program exit is going to get a little more complicated, and periods of participation are a totally new concept for us in Title II. However, one of the things that I want to point out, and I might revisit this a little later, is that periods of participation were included in Title II's portion of the legislation because it levels the playing field for us with our Title I partners. They have always dealt with periods of participation, and it helps us to more equitably compare things like numbers served. So keep that in mind as we work through the next few pieces of information today. And as always, if you have questions or I'm going too fast, because I know I talk fast, holler at me and ask me to repeat myself or slow down, or go ahead and ask your question. So program entry, as I said, this is pretty much the same as it has always been for us. Program entry is the date on which a reportable individual enrolls in an adult education and family literacy program. So when they come in and they're actually taking that step to become a reportable individual, which generally means they're going to sit down and fill out some kind of intake paperwork with you. I think we all pretty much agreed on that last week. That's their date of program entry, and that has not changed. You record that date on their intake sheet, and that's the day they become a reportable individual in our programs. They're not a participant yet, but they're at least reportable because they've done some piece of our intake and orientation process to indicate their intention to participate in our program. Okay. We did have, and I think we've kind of alluded to that already, a little bit of discussion last week about extending that orientation and intake period for the purpose of collecting data on some of those barriers to employment, but the program entry date would still remain that date of initial intake. Okay? Program exit, then, is a little bit of a shift. Technically, a person isn't exited until 90 days have elapsed without them receiving a service from us. So 90 days without hours, essentially. They've not come into class, they've not come in and done any assessments with us, they've not come in and had a post-GED counseling appointment, nothing like that. They've had 90 days without service of any kind from us. And if there is no additional service scheduled in the future. So exit doesn't occur until 90 days has elapsed from the point of that last contact with our participants. And then the date of exit is actually the last date the participant received services. So for all intents and purposes, the last date that they have hours in LACES becomes their exit date. What does that mean? It means that if somebody left our program and their last date of hours was October 31st, 2016, they weren't considered exited until 90 days beyond that, which is about the end of January, January 31st, 2017. But their exit date after that time is still October 31st, 2016. Confused or okay?
Amy says we're okay.
Okay, good. Somebody's okay.
We're okay.
Okay, good. This is also similar to what Title I has dealt with all along. They've had this 90 days without service for as long as I've known, and then the other piece is, though, to remember that they don't have any additional services scheduled. If somebody is leaving for a long period of time, you've got a student who's expecting a baby and you know they're going to go on maternity leave. They call you and say, okay, I had the baby. I'm going to be gone for at least 3 months. You can say, okay, so you're planning to come back, you know, it's 3 months from today would be around the end of May. So you're planning to come back about May 23rd? Yeah, that sounds about right. So there is not yet, but there will be a way for us to, in LACES, go in and schedule that scheduled future service date and say, this person is planning to come back on May 23rd, 2017. And that will prevent them from exiting even if that 90 days has elapsed. Okay? We don't have that functionality yet in LACES. So, you know, Laura and I had a little conversation about this morning, and one of the things I said was, you know, even if we know somebody's left, like John Taylor told me not that long ago, you know, so-and-so moved to Minnesota, they exited the program. They moved to Minnesota. We're fairly reasonably sure they're not coming back, but technically they haven't exited the program yet because 90 days hasn't elapsed. I can go in and make a note, move to Minnesota. I can probably even put that exit date in, but it doesn't really become official until 90 days have passed. Questions about that?
So if they popped back in, say on day 84, just to say, hi, I'm back and I'm interested in coming back to class next quarter or in next month or in 2 weeks, what does that mean?
I think that if they say I'm interested in coming back, that I would record that they had been in the office that day talking with me about our program. I would record however much time they spent with me, and I would probably say that, you know, I would try and pin them down as much as possible. Okay, so you're interested in coming back. When are you coming back? Give me a day. You know, give me a date. And even if it's an approximate date.
And I'll call you after I get done at the doctor in 2 weeks for my uncle's brother's big fat toe.
Exactly. But that you, I mean, if they say, I'm planning to come back, you can consider that a scheduled future service. And what happens then is
but do we want to?
Well, I think we really kind of do. Because what all that happens
is... Here's my thought on that. Yes, because if they leave and then by chance they pop back in and you can get a post-test out of them, if they had that 90 days, then you're only going to get to count half of what you would normally get to count as a gain.
Exactly. And I think here's the other thing. The worst thing that happens in that scenario is you're at 4. They say, okay, 2 weeks from now, I'm going to come back. So you go and you put that scheduled future service date in. The worst thing that happens is 2 weeks from now, they don't come back. You try and call them, their number's no longer good. You don't see them at Walmart. You don't see them at McDonald's. They're gone. All that happens is they didn't come in for that scheduled future service, and they revert back to what their original exit date would have been, which is that 90 days after their last service.
Okay, so it doesn't really make us have to wait another 90 days to...
No, it doesn't really make you have to wait another 90 days. You can go in and say, this person scheduled a future service with me, and it doesn't extend it a whole nother 90 days. It would just give us some play to say it's possible they're coming back in, and if they don't, it just reverts back to the original exit date.
Perfect.
That's a very good question.
That's what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions about that? Yeah.
Becky and Laura, to take that situation one step further, as instructors, when we're negotiating or determining a scheduled service like that, is it conceivable that we need to phrase it in a way that gives us a little, and I don't want to manipulate data or these schedules, but I also have to understand, you know, in terms of perceptions of time, you know, I'll be in next week versus, so what you're saying is that you'll be in by May 1st? You know, do we need to rephrase it so that we can, because then what happens if they say, yeah, I'll be in next Wednesday, and they don't come until the following Monday? Did we just, over a course of 3 business days, create a new period of participation because of the way we mark that scheduled service?
Yes. So I think that you're not incorrect, John, and I don't feel like it's manipulative because we know our participants aren't great with time regardless of their cultural background. That's not just the Native American students, that's all of them. You know, 3 days can sometimes mean 3 weeks. So I think that I would always err on the side of extending and not extremely. I mean, if somebody says, I'm going to come in next week, I would give them a couple of weeks. I wouldn't give them a couple of months. Does that make sense to everyone?
I think so, but I'm just looking for some validation and sort of thinking aloud here in terms of the policy and then how we pragmatically implement it when we're setting these schedules, because yeah, should we automatically tack 2 weeks to whatever date we could get an individual to, you know, suggest or proffer?
There wasn't a great deal of federal guidance at the training. Would you concur with that, Laura, regarding those time periods, other than they just can't be indefinite? You can't say that they have a scheduled future service sometime between now and June 30th. That's going to look suspicious.
Yeah, yeah.
But they didn't really pin it down to, you know, you must know within a certain amount of time whether they're coming back.
No specification like that given.
Right. I think it has to be reasonable, and I think whatever we determine for that individual is reasonable is going to be considered okay. So I really think it could vary.
Were you thinking LACES will have the sophistication? Did we touch on that at the last LACES webinar, that it will have the sophistication to bump off a scheduled future service date if no hours have been entered?
That was kind of the indication we had from Shannon, but I'll be very interested to see what it looks like, quite honestly. I'm interested to see how it works.
I agree.
Yeah. And the whole reason we're concerned about that program exit and that 90 days is because every time we hit a program exit, every time there's a 91+ day gap in services for a student, that new entry, if they come back, is counted as a period of participation, even if it occurs during the same program year. And participants with more than one program entry will have multiple periods of participation in a program year. So what does that mean? If someone enters the program and gets enough hours to count as a participant, so at least 12 hours with us, then they leave and have a gap of at least 90 days without service, they're exited. If they come back during the same fiscal year, they're counted again, and their second entry is a new period of participation, and it's like they're a whole separate person as far as data and performance. This is important because it can really, as Steph alluded to earlier, it can really have an impact on your performance data, because if they're coming in and out and in and out, what are the odds that they're making gains every time they come in and out and in and out? So we're going to think a little bit about the ramifications of multiple periods of participation for our students. Let's think about just measuring skill gains, measuring EFL gains, measuring those measurable skills that we're accountable for on Table 4. So if you think about Table 4, the gray dots here are program entry and re-entry. The red dots are program exit, which indicates 90 days since their last service. So, and we've got our program year July 1st to June 30th across the bottom. So the first period of participation here, someone comes in maybe on July 1st. They get 12+ contact hours and they exit. We know they exit because 90 days elapse after the last time that we see them. And there we would have to evaluate, did they get a skill gain? Did they raise an EFL? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. They have the potential to come back in for a second period of participation. And again, as long as they have an entry and at least 12 contact hours, that's one more period of participation. And after 90 days has passed since their last service, we evaluate measurable skill gain again, and we say, did they make a gain or did they not make a gain? In theory, someone can have up to 3 periods of participation in one fiscal year. So in theory, you know, somebody comes in July, they exit sometime in September. You've got that 90-day gap, but their exit day stays September. They come in at the end of October. They leave at the end of December. And again, you've got a 90-day gap, but they could come back in again in February and be with us till the end of the year. They're actually counted as 3 separate people. And if you think about, like I said, how often those people actually gain an EFL within each of those little chunks of participation that they have with us in a year, it can really impact the way your data looks at the end of the fiscal year. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Does anybody have any questions about the ins and outs and the number of times people come in and out, or can come in and out? The feds tell us they've looked at this data and they think less than 10% of adult ed participants will ever have more than 1 period of participation. Yeah, I don't, you know, I hate to doubt their numbers, but
I could be wrong. I could be wrong too, because you know, they tell me they've only been gone 2 weeks and it's been 6 months. So
exactly, that's true. That's true. So.
And then the other thing that I was really thinking about is a lot of times, even though when I'm really tracking this and really looking at it, kind of what I've realized is a lot of times people push that 90-day mark, but they come in and they're at 74 days, 72 days, and they come in long enough to have some service, and that would extend it out another 90 days. I think it might, the second period of participation might be likely, but I think a third would be pretty unlikely.
Oh, I agree with you, Steph. I would hope that we wouldn't hit many people with 3. Yeah. We also have to think about the ramifications of periods of participation with our follow-up indicators, with our employment indicators, because since these people are considered a new person every time they come in, that means that we have to do follow-up for those exit-based measures, for the employment measures for Table 5. So if you think about, again, you know, we're doing follow-up on employment after the first period of participation, after the second period of participation, after the third period of participation. That pushes the amount of time that we're following that person and hoping that they stay employed out a long ways, because when you're talking about following up in the second quarter after exit and the fourth quarter after exit, you're checking almost every quarter for these people out a couple of years. It extends it a long ways. So again, I know that that's not time intensive for us at this point because we rely on data match, but it's still a point to consider that's going to impact our Table 5 performance. You know, how many of our participants are going to be employed in every single quarter, which sometimes can happen depending on how those exits fall for that long a period of time. So those are just some of the things that we have to consider.